Welcome to Channel 17, the Town of Colonie Government Channel.
We're here at the Colonie Town Library for the Meet the Author program. My name is Paul Grondahl. I'm a reporter at the Albany Times-Union. I've had the pleasure of meeting our guest and interviewing her. Her name is Katherine Min. She's the author of a wonderful debut novel published by Knopf called Secondhand World. It's been receiving rave reviews, and Katherine has been on a book tour around the country. Just wanted to start by giving a few comments that advanced reviewers gave to the novel. Publishers Weekly called it swirling, textured, beautifully detailed. Kirkus Review said she evokes period and place as well as characters with stringent attention and honesty. Welcome, Katherine.
Thank you.
Maybe you could talk about at the beginning a brief description, plot summary of your novel.
Yeah, my novel actually takes place in the Albany area, Clifton Park. And the setting is, it's a sort of nameless suburb in the late 70s. And my main character, her name is Isa Myung-hee Sun. She's a young Korean-American girl. At that time in the area that she lives in, there were no other Asian American families. And it's really sort of the story about her parents who came to this country as immigrants. And they in the beginning of the book, you know that there's been a house fire. Her parents have been killed, and Isa has been badly burned and in a burn unit for 3 months. And it's sort of the story about, it goes back in time to how that fire transpired and what happened with their family.
Now, I know there are parallels to your own personal experience. You're Korean American. And some of the details are partially autobiographical. I wanted to talk a little bit about that. I know when I talked with you, you had a wonderful line. You said, fiction is the lie, elegant lie that reveals the truth. Maybe you could talk about that, blending fiction with autobiography.
Right. Yeah, I feel actually uncomfortable calling it an autobiographical novel. The events in the book did not happen. So the actual things that took place. The feeling of the book, growing up in the late 70s in Clifton Knolls, is definitely there. So anybody who is familiar with the area knows that in terms of the neighborhood, in terms of the school, in terms of the time period of the late 70s. Issa's a very rebellious young girl, and she's trying to not only rebel in the way that most kids that at that time rebelled, but also because her parents are pretty strict Korean immigrants. And my parents did come from Korea, so there's that that I understand. There's that's familiar. But in terms of the story itself, I make this family suffer a lot more than my real family ever did. What I wanted to do was talk about the relationship between the immigrants and their American-born children and how it's always fraught with tension.
Right. Maybe you could talk about just the whole difficulty between retaining your culture and assimilation. You've written a story called Eyelids in this book, or we talked about, you knew a young girl who had this procedure to change her eyelids to look more Western, and talk about your own rebellion from your Korean heritage.
Thankfully, I think things have gotten a lot different. Now, I think we have much more of an awareness of diversity and of the ability to accept and embrace multicultural perspectives. Back then, not so much. And I think, the difficulty really is that the generation that comes from wherever they come from to this country, has some pride in their heritage and wants to not have that completely obliterated. But their children who are born here they want to be completely American. They don't want to be different. And so sometimes, like what happens in the book, and also in my life, I didn't learn Korean. And that was partially because I didn't want to. I think that I just wanted to speak English like all my friends. But also there was a feeling from the immigrants, from my parents' generation, that they were learning English, so they were speaking it at home. And Korean was the language that was spoken when they didn't want the kids to know what they were saying. So there's that tension right away. And I didn't really get a sense of my Koreanness or how my heritage was important to me until we moved to Korea for a year, my junior year in high school. My father had a Fulbright scholarship, and when I moved there and I went to an English language school, something happened. I met my relatives. I got to spend a lot of time with my grandmothers, particularly my father's mother, who didn't speak any English, so we couldn't really communicate. But I just really loved her. She was really funny and very loving towards me. And we would just sit together, and she would hold my hand, and we'd smile at each other. And so I started to get sort of more of a sense of how I am Korean. Koreans are called the Irish of the Orient. They're very sort of feisty, very emotional, very open people. And I realized that, even though I was born in this country, there were certain aspects that were very Korean. And so the course of the novel, Issa, in a much harsher way, I guess, learns that lesson too. She comes at the end of the novel to understand something about, especially her father's background, that makes her feel very connected to this Korean heritage that is once removed for her.
Somebody asked me to name the favorite novel that I read in all of 2006, and I said your novel, just because the language is so evocative and lyrical and beautiful, and I think you get so inside Issa's head. You can really feel this tension of this young woman, this teenager, trying to break out, but also wanting to honor her parents and the past. And maybe I'd like you to read a little bit, if you don't mind. The opening might give the viewers a good idea of the texture of your book.
Great, thanks. I'm going to just read the prologue, which I think sets up the rest of the story. My name is Isadora Myung-hee-sun, and I'm 18 years old. I was recently 95 days in a pediatric burn unit at Tri-State Medical Center in Albany, New York, being treated for second and third degree burns on my legs, complicated by a recurring bacterial infection. The same fire that injured me killed my parents, Hae-gyung Chung and Tae-moon Sun, on June 11, 1976, at approximately 3:20 a.m. It's very isolating to recover from a severe burn injury. The pain requires a great deal of attention and inward focus. While your skin tissue rages and dies, you try and put yourself as far away as possible mentally, to take refuge in small, retrievable thoughts. Nursery rhymes are sometimes useful, as are television theme songs and knock-knock jokes. Here's a riddle. A jumbo jet takes off from New York en route to Vancouver with 246 people on board. There's a massive snowstorm, visibility worsens, passengers pray in panic. The pilot loses control, and the plane ends up doing a nosedive on the border of the United States and Canada. The weather is so bad it takes the rescue helicopters 2 days to get to the remote crash site in the mountains. When they finally manage to land amid the snow and the wreckage, they're confronted with a terrible dilemma. Since the plane crashed exactly on the boundary line separating the two countries, the recovering authorities don't know whether to bury the survivors in Canada or the United States. It took me a while to get it. The trick is knowing where to focus. There's so much clamor and confusion, the plane, the storm, the panic, that you're easily thrown off. You end up overlooking what you should have noticed right away. The fact is that survivors aren't buried. They keep walking around. They go through the varied motions of normalcy, trying to forget the screams, the shudder of the fuselage, the sound of crumpling metal, the frozen wait among the dead for rescue.
That's a beautiful opening, and that whole theme of pain, I find so many levels and layers of pain in your book, both the parents for what they've left behind, what they're trying to kind of get through and get past memory, their life in Korea, the young daughter. Could you talk about the different ways you treat pain? It's not just physical pain in your book, it's emotional pain for your characters.
Yeah, it's a real light book. The book starts with fire, and then quickly goes back to the mother's past, and there was an earlier fire in her life, which changed the course of her life and actually brought her to America. So the book is sort of framed by these two fires, and also, this idea of the psychic pain of leaving your home country under whatever circumstances. And the undercurrent here, Koreans have a word that is untranslatable into English, and it's called Han. And I talk about it in the novel, but Han is really sort of roughly translated into a kind of incredible sadness, Korean history, thousands of years of oppression and colonization and deprivation, and this theme of sort of this longing for a united Korea, especially after the war, sort of undercuts this whole book, because for the Korean War was the central event of Koreans of my parents' generation. It literally, they drew a line across the country, and many people have relatives in the North who they don't even know to this day whether they're alive or dead. There was a little bit of a rapprochement in the 80s, and some people got to see their relatives, but still a lot of them, they don't even know what happened to them. So it's this current of sadness that Issa sort of taps into after her parents' death. She comes to realize how, the novel is called Secondhand World because none of us come into this world as a blank slate. Our parents' experiences that they've had even before we were born will completely inform our lives, whether or not we even know what those experiences are. So it's sort of inherited pain or inherited history, but not just pain. I think what was important to me in the book is also, especially at the end, this feeling that Issa comes to feel this connection that she didn't feel in life to her parents, especially to her father, and this connection to her Korean heritage.
I think what's interesting too is her parents, hold so much of that pain in, but in moments it breaks out when Issa's mother begins studying literature, poetry. Can you talk a little bit about that? How words and ideas and verse kind of frees her from everything she's holding in, right?
Yeah, I mean, both Issa and her mother sort of mirror each other in interesting ways. And Issa, one of the ways that she kind of sort of creates an identity for herself different from her parents is through language, through the English language. And she gets very hyperfluent. She's a big reader. She looks words up in the dictionary all the time. She's kind of a book nerd the way I was when I was that age. And she creates this incredible hyperfluency for herself. And then her mother goes back to school and starts to take these poetry classes. And through poetry, even though Issa's mother's English isn't perfect, she discovers this incredible emotional access. And Issa's mother is very, she's very emotional, very romantic, in some ways perhaps mentally unstable. But she finds in poetry this real outlet because she's had this, her son, Issa's brother, has died. She's gone through this incredible period of grieving, and it's sort of a way for her to sort of put all of that and her loneliness. Her husband is a scientist. He's not given to poetry, so there's this interesting dichotomy there.
Issa's father is ultra rigid. I'm wondering if, to me, as an outside reader, not of this Korean culture, I almost found him abusive. Do you think his strictness kind of crosses the line? Obviously, Issa needs to break out, but in the way that you portray him, maybe you could talk about either culturally, is that really strict father figure kind of the norm, or?
Well, certainly in the culture, it's supported by Confucianism. The idea of the father is here, and the children are here. Filial piety, that kind of thing. I think of Issa's father as being really, really damaged. He's a man who keeps secrets, and he doesn't let anyone in. And he has, secrets to keep. But also the Korean War has really affected him. I think there are certain people, we're facing a situation now with the war. There are certain people who can go to war and come out relatively unscathed, and there's some people who just cannot. And so, yes, I think that Issa's father is borderline abusive to her. He's certainly not a good father in the sense that we think of, and yet he's sort of doing the best he can, and he really is in some way walking through this landscape. He's a successful professor in this country. They've sort of achieved the American dream, but he's still walking around with this incredible wound, and that, I think, is sort of the key to his character.
And it's difficult not to give away too much plot, but you even mentioned Issa has a sibling who dies in the book, and there is tragedy throughout the book of a very real, concrete form. But the symbolism behind that, the father reaching for this kind of image of consumerism, American dream, maybe you could talk about that. He couldn't kind of express himself emotionally, but he could kind of try to provide things that he thought were symbols, but in the end, your underlying message seems to be that those things are very damaging, even,
Right. Yeah, and I think mostly, it's the mother who's really into sort of the real trappings. Like, she's the one who wants an automatic dishwasher, which ultimately plays a very pivotal role in the family's fate. But I think for the father, because he has this sort of emotional sort of wall, the way that he can best sort of, he really does adore his wife. And I think, he wants to provide, in the way that is not foreign to most American families of that time, too. The man was a provider. And so his way of being able to do that is to be able to just, really bring home the bacon.
Right.
And yet, when it comes to actually being available to his children in any way, it's a little difficult. One of the things that I deal with in my novel is, especially in Korean families, the importance of having the firstborn be a male. And in Issa's case, she's the firstborn, and her brother comes along later. So his death to her becomes, without anyone overtly telling her so, she feels a sense of, this survivor's guilt, and a sense that it really should have been her who was the second-born, and the boy should have been the one who lived. And this is her sadness that she carries with her Han, that she carries throughout the book, too.
And the way Issa expresses that, she's only a teenager, a high school student, but this kind of forbidden love, this almost Romeo and Juliet overlay, she chooses this, someone completely abhorrent to her father, obviously. He's kind of a radical, kid who's kind of trying to find himself, and he also happens to be albino. Maybe you could talk about just the symbolism of skin color in that.
Yeah, people always ask me, like, why an albino? And, I always say that it's the unexpected that you pray for when you write fiction, and so it was a surprise to me that he was an albino, too. But I like the idea. I've always been interested in writing about the attraction to the other, and what makes some people just very drawn to people who are in many ways, especially physically different. And so Hiro is absolutely as different from Issa as possible. So she's drawn to him because, he's also sort of a freak in their high school. And yet he seems to accept that and to be really comfortable with it, and she's attracted to his confidence. He wants to be a rock star. He's thinking Johnny, Edgar Winter. And he moves in his world as though he wasn't different, but everyone else was different. And Issa's attracted to that because she doesn't feel that way about herself. She feels very insecure about the way that she's different. But also this idea that here's someone who has an absence of pigmentation, and she feels herself as always being sort of dark, the other, in another way. And so she sees Hiro always in terms of light, and in terms of, she always talks about him being sort of pearly and luminescent, and she's really sort of, it's almost like she's seeking, this light. She feels that her family is shut in, that especially after her brother's death, that they're sort of hermetically sealed. And so through Hiro and through her best friend Rachel, who comes from a very hippie kind of family, she finds this outlet, which, in the book, I mean, we talk a lot about the pain and the suffering and the tragedy, but there's some lighter moments too, and those are all when she's with her friends. They go to a Who concert at the Saratoga Performing Arts Center, and that whole sex, drugs, and rock and roll sort of that was happening sort of in the late 70s is Issa's escape, but she really sees it as an escape from the dark.
And I know you're not all that comfortable talking about your own background, but for our audience here, I mean, you grew up in Clifton Park,
right.
You went to Shenendahowa High School. Talk a little bit about being a Korean-American student at Shenendahowa High School in the early and mid-1970s. I remember you telling me you grew up wanting to be blonde, wanting to fit in.
Right.
Some of the cruel names kids called you. Can you talk a little bit about that and how you rebelled? You had a system of wearing the kind of punk clothes you wanted to wear. Can you share
right.
some of that?
Well, there were, I think there was one other Asian American family that I knew of when I was going to Shenendahowa. Things have changed a lot, I understand, but when I was there wasn't. I'm the same age as Barbie, and when she first came out, she only was blonde. And so when you don't see any representations, people like you in any of the media, you feel invisible, or you feel like you're not in any way a visible symbol of what could be beautiful, what could be desirable. And so in that sense, yeah, I mean, I wanted to be blonde. When I got older, all of my boyfriends were blonde. I ended up marrying a blonde. So in that sense, I think it is true that exploration of other and attraction to other very much applied to me. A lot of the bullying, like in the book, Issa's called names on the bus and so forth, and that did happen to me. More actually, I moved from Charlottesville, Virginia, where I had lived until I was 9, and a lot of that happened there, but a little bit happened here too. And again, fiction exaggerates and dramatizes, and so I took all of that and I sort of intensified it, and I made it have a much bigger effect on Issa than I think it had on me. But I do remember this one point where, I was probably right around 9 or 10, where, someone came up to me and said, in this very accusatory way, you're Chinese. And all I knew was that was not right, and so I said, I am not Chinese, I'm Korean. And then she just looked very puzzled, and she was like, well, what is that? And I didn't know either. So we both kind of, looked at each other like, I don't know. And so that sort of realization that, I was different, but I wasn't, I wasn't Chinese, I wasn't Japanese. I was this other thing that nobody seemed to know, what it was, because there was very little sort of awareness of the war or any of, of Korean history.
There's an interesting tension, and it comes up a little bit in this book, that kind of mocking, shunning of the other by the American, suburban students, and yet you talked about, and you've explored it to greater extent, I think you will in future writing, about this fetish with Asian women. Could you talk a little bit about that sort of push and pull, attraction and pushing away? And
right. Well, again, my second novel is very much about this idea of Asian fetishism in this society, and it's this idea that for a number of not just Caucasian men, but also African American men, I found that there's this sort of tendency to think of Asian women as being exotic and submissive, demure, all of these sorts of stereotypes of Asian women, the geisha. And, no Asian woman I've ever known has been like that, born here or born in Korea or China, Japan. Very strong, very fierce women, especially Korean women. And so I'm interested in exploring that. Where did that stereotype come from? And sometimes there's this idea that it's a good stereotype, but what does that really mean? And so again, about the attraction to the other. What is it that's different between being attracted to blondes as I was, or being attracted to Asians, as many people are. So in my second novel, I deal with that much more concretely, that sort of sense of attraction to the other and sort of getting lost in foreignness.
Maybe we could talk a little bit about just the practicality of your writing life. You're a mother, you are a professor, you teach. Talk about the different things that you do and how you juggle your different roles.
Very badly. My kids are older now, but when they were younger, most of the writing that I did, and all of this book, was written at the MacDowell Colony in Peterborough, New Hampshire, which is an artist colony where you can just I would go for up to 8 weeks. They give you a little cabin in the woods, and they deliver your lunch basket outside your door. It's heaven. And you can write. That's the only thing you're supposed to do. There's no phone, there's no internet, there's nothing, and you just write. And so I get a lot of work done in those stints. And then I would go back to my life, and very little writing would get done. So I'm in some ways a bad model for writing because I'm a binge writer. I'm not somebody who writes every day. And people always talk about how it's important to have regular habits. I have no regular habits, but I also know, and I've come to trust the process, which is that a lot of times when you're not writing is when a lot of that real work is happening. Is when you're thinking about the book. And you can't really, and I've learned this sort of the hard way, you can't really write before you're ready. So I was thinking about this book for years before I actually wrote a word. And then once you've really thought it through, the actual writing of it is more sort of just kind of a just sitting down and doing it as though it's almost sort of a more mechanical process.
And you've had some great teachers, I know, Mary Gordon, Marilyn Robinson, two terrific novelists, short story writers. Maybe you could talk about what they brought to your craft. And I believe Marilyn Robinson gave a pretty harsh assessment at one point, but that propelled you forward, that helped you in your writing. Can you talk about the two of them?
I worked with Marilyn Robinson at the New York Writers Institute, actually. So I was at a workshop with her for 2 weeks. And she's she's brilliant and formidable woman. And I remember she read a short story of mine, and she just picked it up and she said, "This is not a story," and she proceeded to say why, and she was absolutely right. And some people at the workshop came up to me afterwards, and they were like, "Wow, you don't listen to her. You're doing fine." And I was thinking, she just gave me the best advice possible, and I totally agree with everything she said. What do you mean, So she really helped me identify, what a story was.
She said what? It's just incident, if I recall.
Right.
What did she mean by that? That it just didn't hold together?
It really was not rising beyond the level of the newspaper headlines. I was trying to write a story about the LA riots. And she said, nothing from my story was really giving her any more information than she would get by reading the newspaper. And she was absolutely right. And I revised the story, and it got published, and did quite well. So, and Mary Gordon, I studied with at Amherst, and she was the first writing teacher I had, and she was just incredibly generous. Again, she comes to the New York Writers Institute quite often. But yeah, you need good teachers, and I found that the best teachers I've had have been practitioners, people that I very much admired as writers.
And when you teach, you still are teaching at Plymouth State University?
Yes, but I'm about to move.
Oh, you are? To where?
I'm teaching at UNC Asheville in North Carolina.
Oh, great.
Starting in the fall.
Congratulations.
Thank you.
You have a line, I know, that you tell your students. What are they to pray for in their writing?
Well, just that it's constantly surprising them. Because, Robert Frost said, no tears in the writer, no tears in the reader. And I sort of carry that through in anything. You want to be surprised and sort of caught off guard by your own work. And if you feel like your work is predictable, or if you feel like your work is ordinary, then other people are going to as well. So it's always these things that you didn't sit down with your conscious mind intentionally to write. It's when something comes out of nowhere and you think, wow, how did that happen? That's, you know, where the gold is.
Well, Katherine Min, this has been an enjoyable interview. I appreciate the time, the Meet the Author series at the Colonie Library. Again, Katherine Min, the novel is Secondhand World, and I'm Paul Grondahl. Thank you very much.
Thank you.